And let's make a start then. So,
right, everybody who's happy for the recording, thumbs up, so she's got a record. And thumbs down if you're not. Okay. You have to do that, Lindsay, otherwise everybody here didn't have the right.
Yeah, good. Thank you for taking care of that. Okay, well, so hello and welcome to this webinar. I'm Lindsay Outenbogard and I'm hosting the webinar on behalf of Mirror Mirror. So we're joined by a panel of experts in a variety of discipline areas, as you can see, and they're all members of the Mirror Mirror network. I'll let you say a bit about yourselves before we go through the content. You can pass the ball to each other if you like. Do you want to start, Adrian?
Yeah, sure. My name is Adrian Korevaar. I'm based in the Netherlands, and as a private consultant, I work with clients abroad who manage remotely. I coach them, train them in areas of leadership and how to become most effective. Susie.
Thank you, Adrian. Susie Giles. I am also based in the Netherlands, live in The Hague. I run an organisation called Giles Global Communications. So I'm a communications consultant. I work with a variety of organisations, but a lot in the education and the not-for-profit sector.
My name...
Steve.
Oh, I'll catch that one. Hello, my name's Steve McCann. I'm the McCann of Rees McCann. What we say is we help people who work apart work together, better, boldly claimed, based in the UK. Michael.
Thanks, Steve. My name is Michael Moriarty. I'm an independent coach. I coach leaders and I coach teams, usually leadership teams, and I operate out of the UK.
Thank you, Michael. I'm John Hall. I'm the Operations Director at Scarbeck Associates. We're a boutique strategy implementation consultancy. Strategic alignment's a big part of that, and in particular, I'm working in the area of alignment in temporary teams of purpose that are put together to deliver key strategic initiatives.
Good, thank you. So we came up with this idea of this webinar just a couple of weeks ago because, as we all know, the world is in a very different place than it was back then. And when people are thrown into working in remote environments, the alignment issue can become even bigger. We're often confronted with the reaction that alignment, can be a bit fluffy, but the cost of misalignment is very real indeed. So I'm just going to start sharing a few slides just to go into sort of the background behind this. So Mirror Mirror is the reason why we're all together and members of this network is because we use a tool and a process that helps to measure, identify and address gaps, alignment gaps in teams. And these are alignment gaps to the strategy and between people, and they can be cognitive and behavioural. We'll go into that in a bit more depth, but for the moment we looked at, well, what are the common problems with remote teaming? And kind of split them into these two areas, and we recognise that behavioural and cognitive are connected areas. But we wanted to look at and give a few tips that could help people at this time in these areas, in personal transition, collaboration and leading, facilitating online. And then on the cognitive side, it's more about understanding each other, the strategy and stakeholders. And now each of these areas, it's worth saying, could well be a webinar in of their own right, at least. So we're just going to be covering kind of top tips. But perhaps we could have a look now at just what that link is between cognition and behaviour. And the research is quite interesting, and that's what the Mirror Mirror tool is sort of built on, about team effectiveness, is that clearly teams are more effective when they're aligned, but more cognitive alignment, that's in the way that people see things, actually comes from behaviour. So behaviour in 4 categories or 4 areas, if you like, particularly around psychological safety. We've all heard about that a lot over the last couple of years or so. Task cohesion, about commitment, group potency, how much confidence teams have in their ability to succeed, and in interdependence, how much they rely on each other. If you have those behaviours going on in a team, people are much more likely to kind of open up and to open up their ideas to each other and to understand each other, and then develop this cognitive alignment that's ever so important for team effectiveness. So let's perhaps go to our expert panel to find out more and to go into the top tips around that. And starting up, we have Adrian, who's going to talk to us about the personal transition to remote. Adrian.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. So just a few weeks ago, when we just started this whole lockdown, I was very encouraged to hear a client say that her boss didn't expect 100% output from her. Encouraged because for both leaders and colleagues, you know, this is a time of sudden change. Working remotely is very different from working at home. And I think there are three things that are very important in this stage. The first one is to recreate the social environment. The second one is to adapt your leadership style. And the third one is to change your mindset, or at least be clear on it. And I'll start with the last one, because I think that's the most vital. So as we're going through change, we need to change behavior, we need to adapt. And research tells us that actually a focus on intent, on doing your best, is much more effective than a focus on results. So however much results-based management has brought us, right now it's a time to shift focus to effort. So how much do you do your best to deal with the current situation, to obtain results, to effectively interact online, to focus despite the different distractions? To make this even more effective, it's very important you keep yourself accountable on a daily basis and that you keep track of how much you do your best. That really helps. The second one is focus on the person. It's a style issue. I was working 6,000 kilometers away from my boss various years ago, and I was managing a remote team of about 500 people. And at a certain moment, I just lost it. I didn't see the bush through the trees, or the other way around in English. I called her up in despair and I said, I need help. She said, give me half an hour. And half an hour later, she called me back. She said, you know, I'll be landing on the airport tomorrow at that time. That is stepping in. That is being there as a leader. And I think you can do that, and you can do that easily online. You can just show up and you show interest. You know, the thing is, people do not leave organizations because of its vision, its mandate, its mission, you know, those things. Well, they leave because they feel irrelevant. They don't know how they contribute, and mostly because they feel they are not seen. And you can make them seen as a leader. Step in and, you know, ask them, meet them in the struggle, ask them how they do, how they deal with the challenge, show compassion and offer support. Now, the last part, the environment, that's an interesting one, because, you know, that really requires some creativeness to replicate the coffee table, the chat, the brainstorms, the interaction, you know, all the sparks that you get from being together. And now this requires a virtual coffee, or actually you have an opportunity here. You meet everybody at home. So why not get to know each other even more, and think about, you know, a home tour, or, you know, your favorite objects, or what is your best coffee cup that you use, but be creative and be intentional. Orchestrate this personal connection, this environment. Be deliberate about that. I believe we can all do this with a bit of effort. You can do it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So the next part of our section is over to you, John, on effective collaboration.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, there's a large amount of work that we've been doing recently with cross-functional teams of purpose. So these could be a typical case might be teams in a pharmaceutical company, and if they need to deliver a key new innovation to market, requires a lot of cross-functional, cross-geographical collaboration. They're often in separate locations as well. So the last few weeks, we've been doing work with a number of these clients in actually a virtual environment. So techniques and processes that we've trained and embedded physically with them, we've been starting to do in virtual rooms. And these are virtual rooms. They've got analogs of the physical rooms we used to work with them in. So they've got walls, they've got timelines, they've got templates, they've got post-it notes to work with, flip charts, etc. I mean, I think the headline is, to our surprise, the degrees of alignment and commitment that these teams have been able to achieve when working in these virtual environments has surprised us. Certainly, we thought the processes we facilitated them in the physical rooms, and some of the group dynamics that would occur, so group flow, the level of commitment, the fact that people were working stood up, working with post-it notes away from screens, in these physical environments was a key ingredient. So we've been quite surprised at how well these sessions have started to work in the virtual environment as well. And just to share, I think, some of the key lessons that we've got from the the last few weeks. I think the first one is not to neglect integrative processes just because you can't meet in a room anymore. So it may seem difficult now, and in fact, the first team we worked with, I mean, they were due to work in a week's time physically together on a plan for a major enterprise system rollout. Obviously, that was cancelled because of the coronavirus. And it would have been easy for that team just to skip that session and say, well, it's difficult, and for them to retreat into their functional silos. Now, what we found within an hour of working in the virtual room with them was the plan they brought to that session, the plan they had before that they were going to work on, was in fact wrong, and they weren't going to be able to deliver. The plan would have unravelled further down the line, but if they'd neglected it, then it would have joined all the other initiatives we often see in organisations that end up being done twice, being done 3 times, not achieving the key objectives. I think that the second learning we'd like to share is that the right virtual collaboration tool can be really great, and it's worth investing the time to find the right tool. And you might find some of these in quite niche places. We've used interns for these projects to sift through what's out there. These are guys from Generation Z from King's College, so they're much more savvy than us. And some of the solutions that we're looking at now have come from, for instance, online multiplayer gaming, in terms of looking at multi-channel communication. The work we're doing now, and it's quite timely, we spent a year sifting tools for this particular type of technique, and we're really happy we've got something that's really good now, and there's a lot of other good ones out there as well. Third learning as well is on the effort, and I think we learned it requires extra effort in the virtual environment to achieve the degree of alignment that really you want to. So far we're using 2 facilitators. Maybe it's because we're at the relatively early stages. One person is focusing on the tech and making sure that doesn't get in the way of the interaction, and the other person focusing on the group and the group dynamics, and making that effort to make sure they explain to each other their work, that they explain the acronyms to each other, particularly where people are working in individual technical areas, so people really start to understand how their work fits together, who's dependent on who for what, rather than just staying in their functional silos. Fourth lesson we found is that despite being in the virtual environment, important group dynamics still can take place. And we've been quite surprised to see the markers of the dynamics I was talking about before. So group flow states, a bit like a jazz ensemble or something working together, where the group really are starting to think collectively. You see the personal values of individuals start to be backgrounded. You see the group values start to be foregrounded as people work collaboratively on planning what they're going to do together, how they're going to work together in the future, what's going to happen in time and space. And that shared consciousness and commitment was still coming out in the virtual environment. I think the fifth lesson was around maintaining intent. And again, it's something that we were worried about because these are quite chunky sessions, potentially half a day, an entire day of interacting in the virtual room. But there's some quite useful tools that we found. So the classic ones, energizers, waiting for breaks. There's plenty of short videos on YouTube you can mix in to encourage people to get up to do a quick desk routine as well. We've also found some of the technical tools within the systems help us. So timers, setting short sprints for teams. So they go away, they break out, they come back, they report back to each other frequently, they cross-brief each other. And also techniques like guided navigation, where sometimes people can work independently in the rooms and then you bring them back together through one viewpoint and walk each other through the work they've been doing as well. So applying thought to how we keep people engaged over the course of half a day or full day has been a really important lesson for us as well. So that's a quick canter through what we've been doing. I hope that gave some useful ideas, and hope it encourages people to seek out just the right tool so they don't have to make shortcuts in some of the key processes to get alignment for your key initiatives.
Thanks, John. And were some of those teams dealing with remote working for the first time then in these virtual rooms?
Yes, and I think originally because they work in hubs around the world, we were initially looking at a hub solution and using touch screens in the hubs. But in fact, the first team we worked with, they just happened to be, every single person was at home by themselves in the first week of remote working. So in fact, that was perhaps a different type of working to the one we initially anticipated, where maybe you're working between 2 hubs and a couple of remote people.
Right, okay. And I suppose if there's anybody on the line who wants to chuck any tools that they particularly recommend into the chat, please do. It can be a bit confusing to find those lists and those recommendations. But thanks very much, John. Perhaps now we just move on to top tips now from Michael on leading and facilitating remote teams.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Lindsay. I'm going to talk about leading remote teams, and particularly in uncertain times like the ones we're facing at the moment. And as Adrian suggested, it needs a psychological shift, because we no longer feel as leaders connected, even if we weren't really connected physically beforehand. But in essence, nothing's changed. As a leader, it's still our responsibility to set the course for, be it a team, be it an organization, a business, whatever it is you're leading. So people need to know where they're headed, and they need to know what the purpose of what they're being asked to do is, what it looks like. So for example, if you're a manufacturing business, you might in the current climate have to scale right back to service your 5 key clients. But people need to know that so that energy is devoted in the right direction. The second point there is that everyone needs to know who's responsible for what, and on an individual basis, so you know what you're required to do, but also so others know who to work with to get things done. And separation, and particularly isolation, which is happening for many people, has a way of messing with your sense of time. So as a leader, you've got to be completely clear about when you want stuff delivered by. Now, we all know this from experience, but you can't do it all as a leader. It doesn't stop people trying. And in the face of uncertainty, our natural instinct, the uncertainty and high risk, is to try and tighten control. In fact, it doesn't work when people are dispersed. You have to trust people to get on with what you've asked them to do. But something that will help you with that trust is being sure that what you've asked them to do is understood correctly. And it will reduce the risk of things going wrong. So take the time, devote the time to creating that shared understanding. And it's not just between individuals, but it's collectively as well. And it's that alignment piece, and it makes sure that everyone pulls in the same direction and nothing falls through the cracks. Ask yourself, and what most especially ask the people who are working for you, do they have what they need to do what you've asked them? And if they don't, make sure that they tell you, and then find a way of giving them the resource that they need. And you can't provide everything, so encourage them to collaborate across the network of your business and across the network of everyone you normally interact with. And encourage them to be creative. I mean, if there was ever a time to be creative, this is the time to do it. Now, when you're all separated, you need to have some sort of feedback loop in place so that you know what's going on. So you monitor by putting in place that feedback loop, and that involves communication. And that brings us on to the next one, which is that you're going to need to communicate far more and far more carefully than you normally do. So you should have a regular schedule of meetings at various levels and for various purposes. So for example, the senior leadership team, perhaps daily, you might have a sales meeting once, twice a week, whatever it is, have a schedule and have a format so you know what you're covering in those meetings and who's responsible for what contribution. Separation inevitably amplifies ambiguity. So take great care to be clear in your communications. So who is it you're addressing? What's the purpose of the communication? And critically, make sure that you've been understood in the way that you want to be understood. Now, very quickly, in a command and control type of setup, things will become bogged down if all the communication and all the decision making has to go through you as a leader. So encourage people to talk to each other and to make decisions at the lowest possible level commensurate with the authority they have to make decisions. and then make sure that they report those decisions back to you so you know what's happening. And finally, it's your role as the leader to inspire people with confidence and to let them know at an emotional level that they're capable and they're valued and that together you're going to succeed. And emails don't create emotional bonds. Your people are going to need and they're going to want to hear your voice and through it, your commitment. So communicate in person. It's really, really important. So that's the some of my my tips on leading remote teams, Lindsay.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. There's a lot in there, and I think there's also a lot of benefit to be gained. There's just some advantage of getting it right here on the basic levels. Airtasker did some research with 1,000 employees, half of which were working remotely, and found, you know, apart from the fact that they save a lot of time in travel time with remotely, and apart from the fact they enjoy a bit more time to exercise each week, people at work tend to actually be more productive or work more time per week than they might have done otherwise. So that's just some of the basics there. Other advantages of getting it right. Sarah Milstein is a director with MailChimp. She wrote a really interesting piece, and here's a bias that can actually play to our advantage. So here it says that when a social group is exclusive, they tend to develop more trust and loyalty in cooperation to protect and strengthen their identity and purpose. So actually getting a virtual team feeling more together, using some of those tips that we've just heard about, can bring something more to the team than you had before. Some hard conversations can be easier because some of the emotion is taken out of remote communication. There's less friction, and you kind of force, if you're addressing it, you force better communication about collaboration that improves outcomes. But I think with all of this, we together recognised that there were some stages of remote team effectiveness that people were going through. So it's first, especially suddenly teams, they just need to get stable. It's about, do we have the technical capability to even communicate together when we're remote? And then how do we do things differently? The way that we used to interact needs to change, and just getting those basics right is the sort of first phase that I think probably a number of teams are grappling with at the moment. But once that phase has passed, a lot of these other tips come in where people can then start to get aligned, get more clarity to the strategy, get better aligned between each other, and then move on to a higher level of becoming more effective. And I just want to report some results from the teams that we've worked in the past in terms of those stages. And now these are teams that were in stable situations, and we've got data about how these people in teams felt on average for all teams, and then remote teams only. And so what we're looking at here is that actually, if you see that, compare the difference between any team that's in the top chart and remote teams, there's not that much difference in how much alignment they can get to the organization, the level of positivity, pride, and preparedness, and how they feel about, how clear they feel about achieving their goals. So we were quite surprised because we expected that remote teams would have worse results, etc. But if you get it right, and if you're working on it and looking at alignment, etc., then there doesn't have to be that much of a difference. But you'll notice here that the lowest score here is about clarity on how to achieve goals. So that's just a kind of common problem we have. So this is teams that haven't gone suddenly remote. They're just, this is the whatever situation they're in normally. And then we did get a bit of more data. This is just a single team. So this is just anecdotal evidence, if you like. It's just, I thought it was interesting. There was one team that we did in Asia through the network, and it was just as COVID-19 started taking place. And what we do is we assess the highest and lowest behavior scores, and the shaded areas behind the bars represents the maximum and minimum scores provided by the team. So the bars are actually the averages. And you can see that in this particular team, they were quite confident, they support each other, they've got freedom to be creative and raise issues and questions. fairly positive. The lowest 3 behaviour scores here are tolerant of mistakes, sufficient reflection on progress, clarity on direction of remit. So they're in a deep change. There's COVID-19. Those are the factors that they reported in their context as being concerning, and they've got these things to deal with, and it's that clarity on direction and remit. Now, there is a distinction. It's clarity on direction and remit is different from the previous slide where it's clarity on how to achieve goals. So it's important to be clear on what kind of clarity are we actually talking about here. But let's just now look at another team that also was affected by COVID-19. And this is in Europe when the diseases start to come over this side. But again, those bottom behaviour scores, it could be a coincidence, it's just anecdotal, but it's very interesting that they're exactly the same bottom 3 behaviours that they're struggling with from this crisis: clarity on direction and remit. So just as Michael said, and as was previously said before, that's the bit that goes missing because they don't have the interactive kind of ability to, at face-to-face, to be able to gauge where each other's at that they would have had before. So perhaps now let's go on to the next part of this presentation, which is more about the cognitive alignment side of things, although we know that behaviour and cognitive are inextricably linked. Let's hear from you, Susie, on your tips there.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to touch on some of the things that colleagues have said before, but I think at the moment, what we're all going through with ensuring that you're giving strategic clarity as a leader and your teams are getting that, I think it's really important that you maintain your strategic milestones. So at the moment, what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations have really had to dive into the operational, because these few weeks have been very much about what needs to be done now, what do we need to do to keep business going. But I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of those strategic milestones that we already had in place. If your strategy was already planned out and you already had those touch points, be they quarterly, be they monthly, it's really, really important to keep those going. And I think it's really important to make sure that we still do those things as face-to-face as possible, so that we are interacting as much as possible with each other online. But at the moment, it's also the case that your strategic priorities may change, because what's happening to your business may be creating that change. I work a lot with people in the education sector. They are now having to make the change from thinking about their face-to-face delivery to thinking, how am I going to do this online? Because the way they operate in the future is likely to have to change. So it's really an opportunity to delve into that strategy and have some of your team deep dive into new areas. And that may be that you set people up working on those things. And from a leadership point of view, you may have to let go of some of that, let teams work on that and bring those back together. But the important thing, and as I think those slides you showed, Lindsay, really show, is that it's easy to lose that clarity, and we have to keep that going. Now, times have changed. A lot of organizations go through that. And there's a really great and simple tool which you can use, which we use when we talk to organizations about change. And this really can help you get and keep that strategic clarity and think about how you communicate that to teams. So the tool is called ADKAR, and it stands for these 5 words. So we have awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So awareness is the key, which is, have you been really clear with your teams why they are doing what they are doing? What is the purpose of your strategy? What are you trying to achieve? So the awareness is you explaining the why. With that comes the desire. Now, the desire is really about answering the question for your teams, what's in it for me? Teams need to be motivated and understand what part of their work is contributing to the whole, what is contributing to the purpose of the organization and what you're trying to achieve. So it's really important that you and your managers and your teams are very, very clear at the moment, especially with people working remotely, what they're contributing, why it's important, and how the work they are doing plays a part of the whole. Obviously, with that comes knowledge. Are you sure that your teams have all of the knowledge that they need to do their job? Now, in the situation with some of my clients, they actually don't, because they need to bring in some expertise in online learning if they don't have it. So what they're doing is they're moving to look into their communities, see who has that knowledge, and they're bringing that knowledge in so that their teams can do the work they need to do to deliver on that strategy. And then it comes to ability. So it may be that you need to rethink what are the competencies that we need to deliver on this strategy. How do we get that ability if we haven't got it at the moment? What resources do we draw on? So those are really key elements. And then the final one is reinforcement. And I think it's really important, especially with team motivation, that reinforcement is about making sure that you've been clear, but you continue to be clear on what the why is for what you're doing and what the part is that people are playing. But also celebrate successes. Don't forget to celebrate what you've achieved as you're working remotely. I think it's really, really important to keep bringing people back together and show that they're making progress and show what kind of impact they are having. So a really simple tool, but one that you can apply in this situation or other situations of change, just to make sure you tick all of those boxes.
Thanks, Susie. We're getting some interesting bits of chat on the side I can see there, and we can take questions at the end if you have any. But for the moment, I'd like to pass across to Steve, who's going to talk to us about understanding each other better.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Susie. Right, so it's understanding each other. It's very much, it's about what you can see and hear. And what I saw and heard earlier, I was noticing John was talking about engagement and Michael was talking about trust. And they seem really important as we build on this. It's what you see and hear. So if it's about what you see and hear, then during rehearsals, this exercise didn't go terribly well. So see if you can work out why. So if you can just imagine blocking your ears and closing your eyes for a moment. Don't do it really, otherwise you'll understand why the rehearsal didn't go very well. So if you're blocking your ears and closing your eyes, and okay, if I just ask you to just sit down for a while, that'll be fine. But if I'm asking you to get up and walk about, then that's a bit problematic. And if I'm asking you to jog, that's very problematic. If I'm asking you to run, then all of a sudden that's extremely difficult. And it's because of if you can't see and hear, you can't reference other people, you don't know what's in the way, you don't know what's wrong. And that makes everything, Michael said it's the same, but it seems to be different. And if you can't see and hear as much, then all the stuff you take for granted just isn't there anymore. So I talk about working out loud. It has been said to work out loud, you can't work too out loud. I think there's a but in there. So what does working out loud mean? Well, it's about communicating, as we've heard. It's not necessarily about email, that hasn't got the emotional connection. But it is about choosing techniques. Some people like to work with the back channel of Slack. Some people use email. I believe strongly in the engagement of face-to-face. We do a lot of remote training and stuff, and people talk about, I prefer it when the training is face-to-face. Well, I don't think you get much more face-to-face than this. It's about seeing people, talking to them, listening. So working out loud is about making sure everybody knows through multiple channels what you're doing. But it's not the same as noise. External processors who are saying stuff out loud, just talking. That's noise, and that's not the same as working out loud. So distinguish between the two is really important. And pick your channels, multiple channels, face-to-face time, listen. And I think if you are transparent and consistent, that actually is really important. And what kind of transparent? Well, there was a one of the things people sometimes say is in your Slack channels, for example, if you use Slack channels, other than something that's hidden for the purpose of HR or finance or similar, make them open to everybody in the work group or the organization. Well, I thought about that, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, because a long time ago, as a young man in training, Colour Sergeant Keith told me, so integrity, sir, is always to be combined with common sense. And I think transparency is hugely important. But I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember the film Liar, I think with Jim Carrey, in which, I don't know, he's struck by lightning or something, and he simply couldn't tell a lie. And as much as we talk about being honest all the time, there is a certain amount of social dishonesty that goes on in conversations that is actually quite helpful. So I do believe greatly in transparency and consistency, but this notion of everybody hearing what everybody says isn't useful all the time. You have to give space in the organizations for people to have conversations that don't necessarily have to be published. So it sounds like a contradiction, but you can be transparent and honest and lead by example, but at the same time allow people to have their own opinions. And I think that comes across, be curious. If it's about understanding each other, I think there are two kinds of people in the world in one regard: the people who want to be understood and the people who want to understand others. If we're really honest, most of us want to be understood, but I think the greater talent lies in understanding others. So if you have a curious mindset and you ask good questions, what kind of WKO, good clean language questions, you're more likely to understand others. And when you understand others, they feel understood. That improves the quality of the whole relationship. And my last thought is be kind, think kind. When we are dislocated through time and space and we can't quite see and hear and understand each other, and you get that email, I mean, you've all done it, reacted to the email, and you've heard the tone, and it's been spiky and aggressive, and actually, maybe it wasn't. So my last thought is to assume the best in others as we try to do our best. Be kind, think kind, assume the best, and be responsible for hearing the tone in a positive way in any communication you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. There's a lot in that. Took us to a different level, so thanks for that. Cognitive alignment. Back to Michael again, who's going to talk to us about keeping in tune with stakeholders.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Steve. I think one of the rather unusual aspects about the current situation is that we're pretty much all up the creek together. So it's quite likely that your stakeholders are experiencing some of the problems, or many of the problems that you're facing. But that in itself isn't enough to have everyone singing in tune. So for me, the most important thing is to know where you're starting from. So what's going on for you? What's your own situation? Sure, internally, but in terms of a team or a business or whatever organization it is that you're leading, what is it that what state are you in? What do you need from your stakeholders, and what can you offer for your stakeholders? And that starts with a check. It's a bit like taking a tumble on ski slope. You pick yourself up if you're able, dust yourself down, and you decide, do I need an ambulance, or am I in a fit state to help somebody else who's just taken the tumble? So it's having that awareness of where you're starting from. Next thing is to review the state of your relationships with your stakeholders. As in our personal lives, so in many other areas, some relationships are more important than others, and some more important at certain times than others. So in your line of work, which relationships are your priorities now, given the changed circumstances? And what state were they in before this crisis? And what needs to change if with regard to that? So you can't suddenly pitch up as one of your stakeholders' new best friends if previously you've ignored them, or for example, you've been a late payer. It just doesn't work. So just review the state of your relationships and what you need from them, and historically where they've been. And you need to check your assumptions about your stakeholders. We've all got our filters, our biases. And it's time in a time of crisis to reassess the assumptions that we've previously made about our stakeholders. And unquestioned assumptions are absolutely the derailers of relationships. So once you've checked where you're starting from and you know, then you want to get on the same page as your stakeholders. And that's about getting a clearer understanding of where they are. And so most obviously, check with them what's going on for them. Steve asked about, wanting to be, or suggested we want to be understood. You really need to understand where they're at. And in some companies will be making out like bandits. So you can think about the medical supplies companies, happy days. But there are other businesses who are going to the wall, think pubs, restaurateurs. So all your stakeholders will be in a slightly different place with their own problems. So you might think medical supplies companies are just coining it. Well, actually, they've got problems because their suppliers can't supply them fast enough. So everyone has their own problems. Listen carefully and listen to understand. Listen to understand what their situation means for you so that you can assess what your options are and also spot what opportunities that may present. And it probably doesn't need to be said, but it's always worth saying that empathetic listening strengthens relationships at the best of times. And in a crisis, it really does lay the foundations for good long-term relationships. So having discovered more about your stakeholder, share what's going on for you with them. And the reason for that is so that you know, they know how they can better support you. And also so that they have realistic expectations of you. So share what's happening for you. And it's really important not to leave a conversation with any of your stakeholders without being completely sure that you have a shared understanding of what's been said and where you're setting off from. It sets the right expectations for both sides, and it allows both sides to work with confidence. So once you're on the same page, clearly you want to stay on the same page. And that takes regular communication and the right sort of communication. So you need to agree with your stakeholders a schedule for communications, how they want to communicate, the best means of communicating with each other, agree a protocol, and most importantly, agree how you're going to get swift attention when you need it from each other. No surprises. We all know in relationships, trust is everything, and reliability is not far behind that. So if you can't deliver on a promise, make sure that your stakeholder knows in good time so that they can adjust their plans. And if you work by the old adage of do as you would be done by, you won't go far wrong in that respect. And finally, difficult times provide an opportunity to create or grow or to develop to deepen a relationship. So think to the future here, and the goodwill gained from going that extra mile for the people you work with, your stakeholders, is likely to pay off many times in the future, further down the line. So so give some thought to that. If you can, do it. And we see it in our daily lives at the moment, the way in which people are stepping up and volunteering left, right, and centre. If you have that mindset, then you effectively create the potential for opportunities in the future with your stakeholders. Lindsay.
Thanks, Michael. And the behaviours around ensuring that you have a shared understanding, just to connect that back through, it would be about asking why, listening, double checking, would you say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's all about really seeking to get under the skin of what's going on for them. So connecting in various different ways, creating an emotional link with them, finding out exactly tell me what's going on in your business, tell me what's going on in your team, what are your problems, what can I do to help. So it's absolutely directed at the other side, at your stakeholder, with the intention to make their life easier.
Good. Okay, so I think we've got a bit of time left over now to go into Q&A. There are a couple of questions that came up. I don't know who wants to take them. One of them was quite a tricky one. It's about, you know, if you, even in a senior level team, if you think you're one or two of the team members have kind of lost the faith and they're just not connecting, they're just not, you know, it's maybe they're overwhelmed or something like that. What can you do as a colleague or a leader? Does anybody want to start with a response on that one?
I'm happy to start, Lindsay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing is, you've got to be connected as the leader. You have got to be connected with the people you work with, and so if you have this sense of people being overwhelmed, or if they're not performing, you need to know why, and that starts with the conversation. So the first thing I'd be doing is getting on the phone, or doing a Zoom call like this where you've got face to face, and seeking to understand what's happening.
Anybody want to add? Steve's looking for his unmute.
No, Steve was looking for the question to remind himself. There's a lot going on in this small head.
Yeah, no, it's really about making sure people stay connected. And I think, Michael, as you've said, this is it's a matter of having these conversations and being present. I got one through WhatsApp that was about, well, people are apparently working more if they're remote because they've got more time to do so if they're not traveling to work. But does it make them more productive? And that there's somebody here who says, I'm certainly not being more productive.
I think it varies tremendously.
It varies, yeah.
I'd agree. And in fact, I've one of the comments from Liz saying that she's found remote teams often have higher engagement. I'm definitely finding that some of the teams I'm working with are very engaged, whereas they wouldn't usually be, because they all feel that they want to share, they want to have that connection. So it is kind of working the right way.
Steve?
It's all about the quality of the experience. One of the things that being, our work, Reece McCann, is in that workspace of helping people work together. So we were there before, we're there now, and one of the things that was being spoken about in the virtual corridors was, well, oh, this is a new age, this is fantastic, everybody's going to be remote. And somebody said, well, maybe not. What if they have a really low quality experience? Then they'll just tolerate it as a really bad way of working and not enjoy it, and then rush back to the office and say never again. And that could happen quite easily, because what we know is we're no longer restricted by the number of meeting rooms in the building. We're no longer restricted by the people arriving at work and leaving work. It's all opened up. The endless possibilities of back-to-back meetings, which are rubbish, are there. And it's only an online meeting. Why do people turn the camera off in online meetings? Fundamentally, no matter what they tell you, it's because they're multitasking and doing their emails. Okay. I must admit, I did one, and I'm meant to be good at this. If you are not engaged, you do not give people a good experience. You don't give them a good experience. It hits the downward spiral. It gets worse because it gets worse. And if you don't pay attention to people and engage, Michael spoke about engage, John spoke about engage. If you don't do that, it could be a low quality experience. It will be unproductive, and people will just write it off as a bad experiment.
John, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think, and just building on that point as well, where all these online meetings are scheduled, then the very much the expectation is wall-to-wall productivity. In our team, for the first time in 3 weeks, at the end of yesterday, instead of our normal end of the day check-in call, we said, right, let's stop this. Everyone just go get whatever you want to drink, and let's just sit and chat. And we chatted for the next 45 minutes. And it felt really good in amongst all the last 3 weeks of everything being very purposeful, everyone wanting to contribute or being forced to contribute because they're called into these meetings.
We certainly get quite a lot of questions about people having different personalities around this, though, people react to remote in different ways, and people have different preferences. I mean, how can you cater for all of that?
I think it all comes back to one of the things that that Michael said, and I think Steve said as well. Do not assume. So I guess even more remotely than in the live room, because we don't see all the interactions, we need to put an extra effort into getting to know the other person and getting to know their preferences. I tend to think that every behavior has a positive intent. So the fact that Steve did an email now, I'd like to know, Steve, what made you do that email? What was it that didn't attract you enough in this, I don't know if it was during this session.
It was.
So get to understand, what was it exactly? And how can we do this better next time? Because this is all about agreement. And actually, I also agree with some of the things that John said. I think, the online meetings are often much more effective because we are much clearer on what we want to get out of it, because it feels like a wastage of time otherwise. And we think we can multitask, but actually we can't. So we lose track. We have to get back. But it's about asking the question, understanding who are there in the room with us and how can we cater best for them and for us.
And thanks for your question, Natalie. Natalie's posed a question. She says, at the moment, it's not only about working remote. Some companies experience a tough time, just in general, and the news is full of bad news. So how to help people that suffer from isolation at the moment? Do you have any tips on finding out if people need more support because of the special situation we have now, regardless?
Have you tried asking?
Pardon?
Have you tried asking? Sorry, it's maybe it doesn't sound nice if I say it like this, but I really think that if you want to know, ask the question. And this is something that I train myself in. Every time I think I know the answer, I want to think of one more question to ask just to make sure I really understand. And actually asking the extra question has never let me down.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely clear. And I think what might be between the lines here is what support can be provided to people who suffer the most from isolation at the moment.
Again, it depends. And I think, Natalie, the fact that you've chosen to ask that question is testament to the fact that you're 2/3 of the way there. I don't know if you're quite getting exactly what you want in terms of a do this. There isn't a do this prescription, I don't think. Michael said quite rightly that the old do as you would be done by routine. Well, yeah, I kind of only half agree with that, because I do think that actually do as they would be done by, which is about be curious, be kind, and ask. But you're most of the way there. Just see what they say and then take it from there.
It is a difficult area because there's a whole, you think you know people, but then there's a whole another level of knowledge about a person that becomes relevant, I think, in this crisis. So who's dependent on them, relatives, underlying health issues that make them feel more vulnerable as well. So it is, I think it is a difficult area, and I think, I know the answers are a bit soft, but I think that's the way you have to probe these extra things and understand things that maybe weren't factors before in normal work.
And perhaps even just recognise that it's difficult. I mean, especially people who've got extra pressures, like you say, caring for people at home or dealing with kids at home. Just being confined itself is huge pressure, and having recognition of that and giving people some space and time. Adrian, did you have another point?
I was visiting a friend regularly that broke her back while biking through the Netherlands. It does happen that you're hit by another bike. Anyway, she was hugely challenged. And it was all about her mindset that helped her get out. So she started to draw on the wall in circles every day about the things that she tried, and she made it actually a beautiful decorum. But I think it is in this conversation, people are feeling alone, but it's, and we may be desperate for contact. But in the conversation, I would again go to, okay, this is who you are. This is your situation. As you are dealing with this at the moment, that's okay. What else are you trying? And compliment yourself on the trying and not on the achieving, because the achieving actually to get out of isolation at this moment is really hard, but you can try.
I think that mindset shift is absolutely critical. But I think if you're responsible for people, you can also help where you recognize people suffering from isolation by creating the community they're missing. So, who knows them best in your team? Who do they normally work with most closely? Have an offline conversation with that person and say, will you check in regularly with so-and-so? Find some way of creating the community and connection that the individual is missing, and in the same way as you would in the workplace. If you notice somebody is suffering, be curious, ask, and then put in place some sort of measure to support somebody. In a sense, it's no different. How you do it might be a little bit different, but in essence, it's about providing the support the individual needs.
Another question's just come in. Is this a time to boost focus on soft skills? Adrian, you indicated an interest in answering that.
Yeah. Years ago, I was talking to a colleague, and she said, you know what, actually the soft skills are the hard skills. And I think it is even more true here, because, you know, we're all, within days, companies are able to deal with the technology. You know, we can get that sorted, but it's the, you know, dealing with the technology and dealing with each other and relating in a different way that is becoming more difficult. So I would say, yes, you know, practice this, because it requires something else, something extra from you during this time. So yes.
Michael.
So I just think there's a massive opportunity here. Self-awareness is something which is sadly lacking, you know, in many people, simply because, you know, people don't get the opportunity to think about it. And for those who are self-aware, and I would hope that most leaders have a higher level of self-awareness, is to possibly start asking questions about individuals. So how's this making you feel being at home? And the sorts of questions which are, you know, natural questions given the change of circumstance can be used to increase an individual's self-awareness. So it's just something to consider.
I've got a question that's come in for you, Steve. What do you think is the best way to work out loud for a leader in a temporarily remote team?
Listen, actively listen. I suppose there'll be a hierarchy of things to do. It will be about modeling the behaviors that he or she wants to see in others, be even more than usual, exaggeratedly consistent and transparent. I always thought, as working with remote teams and leading and managing and supporting remote teams, that I wanted everybody to know without any, well, I used to say without any shadow of doubt. I've come to learn there's no such thing. With minimal shadow of doubt, what my position is, and to find me as a leader extremely predictable in the sense of values, consistency, fairness, openness, because when people doubt, I regard it as, you know, you've got full bandwidth and then 50% bandwidth. If you're a bit slippery, if you are not perceived as consistent and straight, then the other 50% or whatever is filled with fantasy, catastrophic fantasy, and that makes things worse and worse and worse. So in an exaggerated way, I would actually say do this all the time, but a bit more exaggerated when people, remember that thing, you know, fingers in your ears, close your eyes, and then try and understand what's going on. People feel a bit like that. So do what's required to take the fingers out of the ears, open the eyes, and exaggerate the purpose without overfilling the airways with just chat. It needs to be purposeful information and consistency.
Just an answer on that brings it back to collaboration tools as well. You know, there are tools out there where, in fact, you can make your work and your priorities and your to-do list very, very visible and visible across a team. So, for instance, Monday.com, probably quite a well-known tool now as well, where you can have a leadership team that runs a little Kanban board on it, so everyone can see what everyone else is working on, what they've got onto, what they haven't got time to do, what they, etc. You know, shared to-do lists. So all the things that perhaps people kept to themselves, you can make them very visible and collaborative now as well, so people know what's on everyone else's plate, what the priorities are across the team.
Well, we're out of time now. Sorry that we can't answer the remaining couple of questions that have just come up. We'd like to do another webinar, so please do contact me or any of the other panelists here if you have a topic on the subject or in the field of alignment that you'd like to have addressed. I'd like to thank everybody for making this happen. I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time today to share your insights, and so thank you also to participants for joining. and a special thanks to Dymphna for supporting back office. I hope this has been useful. We're happy to answer offline questions, as I said, and I'll post a recording of this afterwards. So thanks again. Stay well, everybody, and good luck.
Thanks, Lindsay.